for the recording, right? Not for my projection? Exactly. Okay. But celebrating, and where's Bill? And thanking Bill for coming for our presentation. Probably, but I'd like to give you a little bit of a background on him. Historian for the Perrington and the Village of Fairport. He has had a lifelong interest in history, especially local history, sparked by a school studies, social studies teacher and his own family's involvement in the Civil War. A retiree of operations, Bill helped to secure and preserve the site's historic artifacts. He has also been trustee of the Perrington Historical Society for Preservation Commission since its inception in 2000. Historian, he has led walking and bus tours, given presentations on numerous topics, as well as hosted hundreds of, it's got to be thousands, hundreds of school children each year on field trips to the Fairport Historical Museum and other locations. So welcome, Bill. Thank you very much. And we're going to hear about. This is kind of going on and off. Is it? Am I? Okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good. Yes, I hear me. Nice to see you. Braving our first day of winter, right? I did enjoy being on this preservation commission. It was wonderful, and being there from day one. Chuck, you were there from day one, right? Boy, you've been at it a long time. It was great, important work. So wonderful that you're doing that. And Fairport has really kind of led the charge around here, I think. I was asked to put together a story by the Congregational Church. Back in the spring, they asked me if we could schedule an event for their church congregation because this is the 200th anniversary of their congregation. So I said I can do that, but I don't want to dwell completely on the church because I don't like to talk to a room full of people, many of whom would know more than I do. That's uncomfortable. So I also blended it into, and the Fairport Perrington community and tried to put it in that context so that I can talk about more things that I know about and hopefully make it interesting for you. So I did this just once, and I'm happy to do it again. So let's get started. And I do want to thank two folks that really helped me from the beginning. And I don't know if you know Dave Kuhn. He lives on West Avenue. Great guy and very active in the church. And he really helped me, open some doors in the church and meet the people and rifle through their records. And they are amazing, the archives they have of that history in that church. And also Jean Whitney, very familiar in Fairport and really she helped write your ordinance. And then she was there from day one and for years was the chairperson of the commission. And Jean has been such a mentor and leader in so many ways and helping me understand things. The only problem when you're talking to somebody like Jean is if I want to ask her about a house and she'll say, oh, you mean the Fitzsimmons house? Well, that's because the Fitzsimmons lived there when she was 15, but that doesn't have a lot of relevance to me. I need a number of this, that type of thing. I'm going to show you a lot of maps because maps are very helpful. I'm going to point at two different screens, so whatever one you're looking at will help. This is a map of the Phelps and Gorham Purchase. It didn't come colored. I added color to it for fun. But this dates to 1790. And the reason I'm showing you this is the town of Perrington. Purchased by William Walker, and then the subdividing of our community began. Way back in 1790, our story begins. William Walker. And when I use text like this, I have pulled it out of an ancient document or an old book so that you can get the context of what was written at that time. When Perrington was one of the first townships disposed by Phelps and Gorham. Sounds harsh, doesn't it? Disposed. Set off to William Walker in 1788. He was an agent for that organization, Phelps and Gorham. It's believed that he was probably compensated by Phelps and Gorham by given the land that would become Perrington. In 1789, Caleb Walker, and who was a brother of William Walker, and Glover Perrin came here, really the first people to come here other than the Native Americans that were here. And they came and got busy doing some surveying. And we have a historic marker that you can still see today on Aralt Road. This little girl is standing next to the historic marker, Glover Perrin, and he had a cabin right there. Now there's a 1950 Cape Cod there today, but at that point, early on, there was a cabin there where Perrin lived. I showed this at that last presentation, and a nice lady came up to me and she said, "I'm that little girl." Wow. This photo is 1962, sesquicentennial for the town of Perrington. I'm that little girl. So they engaged in dividing up that Walker land, the entire boundary area of Perrington, into lots, about 65 different lots that then were sold to the earliest settlers that were arriving here. Oftentimes those lots were subdivided again, and some of those people never even came here. The lots were often about 210 acres or so. Most of them were about the same size. Some on the west side of the town were a little bit smaller. And some of the landowners came and settled on all 210, 220 acres. But we didn't start out as Perrington, did we? We started out as Northfield. And you've probably heard that name, and if you drive through Pittsford, they use Northfield, Northfield Commons, different names that they have. They're more attached to the Northfield name. Let me dispel something, by the way. You just saw the date 1789 up there a minute ago. You drive through Pittsford. Pittsford, if you're listening, I'm sorry. On their welcome to Pittsford signs, it says settled, 1789. You know what? So were we. We were both the town of Northfield, and Northfield covered an enormous area east of the Genesee River, where Brighton, Irondequoit, Henrietta, Pittsford, Penfield, Webster, Perrington, all of those places, and maybe a little bit more to the east, were all Northfield. That's how we started out. Some of our earliest settlers were officers and held positions in Northfield. Love to have a kid here. Representing the next generation. Doing advanced math in the room over here before we got started. What did you call it? Compacted math. Like it's not hard enough, it has to be compacted. Good job. So these are the lots that were divided. Perrington, you see these were the smaller ones. And this rough drawing showing the canal. And we are, right now, right about here. So, to demonstrate that these numbers on these maps for Perrington and these lot numbers are still relevant, this is an assessor's property card, and these started in 1927. If you're doing research on properties in the village of Fairport for what you do in preservation, and you need this resource, you can contact me if you haven't got one for the property you're interested in. I'll send you whatever I have, I'll provide to you. But this is a property card for the Congregational Church. And the reason I put this up here, it says Lot 41. So that Lot 41, where the Congregational Church was, starting with Phelps and Gorham, that number carried on in 1927. But not only that, this is right off the Monroe County website today. Still refers to it as Lot 41. So all the way back 235 years ago, those numbers still have relevance. 1800 federal census for Northfield. We see Glover Perrin, and here's his gravestone in the cemetery. Glover was that one of the two. There was Glover and Jesse, the first two to get here. But Glover didn't stay long. Glover never lived in Perrington. He lived in Northfield, here in a log cabin off of Aralt Road there. But very quickly, he moved to what would become Pittsford. And if you know the four corners of Pittsford, on the southeast corner, there's the big brick landmark hotel building. Well, before that was built, there was a smaller building, and that's where Glover's Inn was. He ran an inn there, and this newspaper article from 1805 talks about an important meeting being held, this notice being published in the Canandaigua newspaper, because that was the nearest newspaper in 1805. Canandaigua was rather bustling by then, and held at Glover Perrin's place. The other connections we have to our earliest settlers are, of course, Joanna Perrin's school. These names live on, and it was named for the wife of Joanna Perrin, or of Glover Perrin, and again, they moved to what would become Pittsford very quickly. Ironically, as the opening for this school states, it was named after Brockport's first woman resident. That's not true. So many mistakes in these old newspapers. They're writing a story about Fairport, but say it's Brockport's first. So we have to check what we see and don't believe every newspaper reference you find. Jesse Perrin, here's his gravestone. And this newspaper account from 1911 in a Rochester newspaper talks about Jesse. He was and he's more relevant to our story about Congregational Church, by the way. He was a Revolutionary War soldier, and it goes on to talk about that his grave is unmarked. There's no cemetery gravestone. They said in this 1911 newspaper account, no stone marks his grave there. But there it is. It's there. As historians or researchers in history, we need to really double and triple check the information we're receiving. A lot of it's right. Some of it's not right. Here is that cemetery, that Center Cemetery across from Martha Brown School. And this land was laid out. It was surveyed and laid out by Jesse Perrin. And some of our earliest residents are in that cemetery. Now, this 1829 map of the greater area, I'm going to show you something rather relevant here. We have Penfield, which also encompassed Webster at the time, because Webster wasn't created till 15, 20 years later. Here's Fairport and Perrington, Pittsford, and so forth. There we go. Interesting to see the dynamics of change, of growth in these communities. If you compare Penfield and Perrington, which I love to do, and you look at the populations, you can see that Penfield, early, 1820, had double the population of Perrington. By 1860, that had really started to change. Well, one of the things that changed, the asterisk indicates that by about 1840 or so, Webster had been pulled off of Penfield. But still, if we continue in the years, look at how it's rather surprising that Penfield had 3,200 people in 1820 and only 2,000 in 1920. And look at the growth of our town, 1,600 in 1820 up to almost 8,000 by 1920. There are some very specific reasons for this. First of all, we have the canal. We have the railroads. And not insignificantly, from 1906 to 1931, we had the Rochester, Syracuse, and Eastern Trolley. And even in Bushnell's Basin, the Rochester and Eastern Trolley. These were methods of transportation of people and products, goods, farm goods, raw materials for factories, and shipping products away from those factories. These are all benefits that we had that helped us grow. And one other thing, Penfield, without a railroad and without that method for transportation, our residents began commuting to Rochester very early for work. They could commute on the railroad in the later decades of the 1800s. In Penfield, they had an immense valley, especially in the winter, that they couldn't get through to go to Rochester. So Penfield stayed a farming community, the majority of its residents a farming community longer, much longer than this community did, because of what you see on the screen here, the canal, the railroads, and the trolley. Does that make sense? All right, the anticipated route of the canal is put on this 1907 map, 1817 map. And this dark line shows where the canal was believed to be located. I don't know what this light line is. It didn't come with a glossary. But it's pretty accurate, 1817, so they were just thinking about and really sending surveyors out, and these were amateur surveyors for the most part, they weren't engineers, to try to figure this out. But here's a key point, and we have a fact I tell kids in school. And yes, you said how many kids? Since I've been doing this, I think I'm up over 10,000 school kids now since I started, which is a lot of fun. First graders, fourth graders, sometimes high school kids and middle school kids. April 23rd, 1822. This is a newspaper from the Cherry Valley Gazette, which is east of Syracuse, but several newspapers carried this news that was first published in Rochester, and it says, internal improvement. Transportation on the Erie Canal commenced on the 11th instant. That means the 11th that just happened 5 days ago, near Hartwell's Basin, which was the first name for Bushnell's Basin. It was Hartwell's Basin for only about a year and a half. And that means that's when traffic first started coming through on boats through the town of Parenton and Fairport that essentially didn't exist yet. Oh, one other thing about this. The first day that traffic started, and boats going westward could only get to Bushnell's Basin, Hartwell's Basin, because the Great Embankment hadn't been completed yet. So what a boom it was for merchants, for warehousers, for farmers that were bringing their products to Bushnell's Basin from Rush, Henrietta, Pittsford, Rochester, further places. They were bringing their products to Bushnell's Basin to ship to the eastern markets, which suddenly were open and economically viable to sell to. Example, and this says it here, 10,000 barrels of flour were waiting in the newly constructed warehouses in Bushnell's Basin for those first boats to show up. 10,000 barrels of flour, lumber, whiskey, so many things that were waiting to be shipped. And it really made some people some money. We put up this, courtesy of Pomeroy Foundation, this marker in Bushnell's Basin a couple of years ago to help recognize this. When does Fairport come into the picture? The first references to a place called Fairport that I have seen published are right here. This is a canal directory on the right, and in the center is listings for Macedon, Parenton with 2 R's, Fairport, 2 words, 1828. We hear stories about the origin of the place and the name, and we hear that somebody stayed at what is essentially the big green place. What do we like to call it? Millstone Block. Yeah, the hotel, the Millstone Block. You know why it's called Millstone Block? Thank you. It's called Millstone Block. You would think because there must have been a mill involved, right? A guy named Millstone bought it in like 1912. A Rochester guy with the last name of Millstone. Come on. Also in 1828, in the Rochester Observer newspaper, there are references to people donating and agencies and organizations donating to a cause. Mendon, Wheatland, Penfield. And when we get to the ladies of Fairport, Parenton, 1 box of clothing estimated by the committee at $100.50. That's a lot of clothing at that time. So we see those references to Fairport. As we move on, this is an image of the first aqueduct in Rochester carrying the canal over the Genesee River. And the first hurdle to moving westward with progress for the canal was the Great Embankment, which was opened very late in 1822 and then opened in 1823 at the beginning of the season, although they had their sporadic failures where it would leak and flood and rebuild and start again. But the embankment was a big problem to be overcome. This aqueduct is not the one at Broad Street that we drive over today. This one only lasted about 15 years. It has been said that it was poorly constructed, of some of the wrong materials, and it just didn't hold up. So, but this one was in place starting in 1823. Now, we have a big event coming up this year, 2025. We have the 200th anniversary For us, the 203rd anniversary, but the 200th statewide of the Erie Canal opened from Lake Erie to the Hudson River. Then you take the Hudson River down to New York Harbor, and my gosh, what a monumental event. And you've probably heard about this replica that has been built, the Seneca Chief in Buffalo, that will be coming through our community in the fall next year. A big deal. This is a replica in every way of the original boat, in dimensions, in the way it was constructed, and the material. They used primitive tools to build this. And it will be coming through, and Fairport is one of the only stops where it will be staying for 2 nights. One of the things that some of us have talked about, wouldn't this be fun? When it's working its way here, and it's coming from west to east, and when it gets to Parrington Park, and we'll have no doubt a flotilla and boats and things going on, but to have a massive array of people in Parrington Park that can walk along with it into Fairport, and essentially a parade on the towpath. Someone said we need to have some donkeys or some mules of some kind, even if they're inflatable. Okay, back to the church, because I mentioned Jesse Perrin was important in this whole story. Jesse Perrin's house still stands. It is on Mosley Road, and this is a photograph of it from about the early 1940s. Thanks to a lady primarily, several ladies at the Historical Society, but one I'll call out in particular, Marjorie Snow Merriman, who must have had the skill and energy of 100 people, because so much of our early history was captured and recorded by her. And she went out and did a photographic inventory of many of these places, starting in the early 40s. And then she wrote these captions. On land cleared by him, 1792, Jesse Perrin built this house. I only have a qualm with the idea that he built that house in 1792. I think he built a log cabin there. You know, we didn't have a sawmill then. We didn't have a sawmill until maybe 1812, 13, 14, 15 in that area. And so where would you get saw and lumber? Still, you go in these old houses and you look, and boy, they are old. And this house is very relevant to the story of the church. I went in the basement in the spring of this house. The people that own this house love this home and intend to live there forever. They're so proud and lovingly, caring for this home. But you see the hand-hewn beams. You see, it might be hard to make out, but this is bark wrapped around that log in the basement. It's not hard for me to imagine that components of a log cabin were used there. But I cannot believe, just like with several of our other earliest residents here, I cannot believe that they started in a frame home in the 1700s, because there was nowhere to get sawn lumber. Does that make sense? This is that house, and this caption is written by Charlotte Clapp 100 years ago for the 100th anniversary of the Congregational Church's congregation. It was in the home of Jesse Perrin. On that day, the 18th of December, 1824, a small group of earnest Christians met to form a church organization, presenting their names for membership, 6 by letter from the Congregational Church of Pittsford and 3 by letter from the Congregational Church of Penfield. So they belonged to churches in Penfield and Pittsford, but there was no church for them to go to in our entire town at that point. And they thought it's about time we had one of our own in our community. This plaque on the church, this church does a wonderful job of celebrating their history. And this plaque is a part of it and tells that story. And this, from the church's own records, is a handwritten list of the 9 original members. And, so we have 6 women and 3 men that were the original members that came from those 2 churches. We'll talk a little bit about some of them, but the connections to the Perrin family are overwhelming. First of all, Mrs. Huldah White, she was a sister of the Perrin brothers. So there's a Perrin. Lemuel White, well, his mom was Huldah White, a Perrin. Seems like there's another 2. Oh, Miss Nancy Blackman, her dad was Jesse Perrin. So about half of the original folks that were the members of the Congregational Church were Perrin family members. And here's that list. Huldah White, I talk about what their relationship is with our town. She was the sister of Glover and Jesse, the wife of Abner White, the designated historical property at 234 South Main Street, the Abner White House. Nancy Blackman was the daughter of Jesse Perrin. She went on to move to Macedon, but she was there on that first night in that house of Jesse Perrin, her dad. Lemuel White was the son of Abner. Abner served in the Revolutionary War. Lemuel served in the War of 1812. Leah Packard, her husband, was the first town supervisor of Perrinton. You know, the town started in 1812, and at that time, her husband became the first town supervisor. We have the Eaton family, one of the earliest families in Perrinton. Her husband was a Revolutionary War veteran and bought his land from the Perrins. Nathan Norton, his wife, Lettice Norton, was one of the 9, and their home still stands on Pittsford-Pelmire Road. I'll show you that. It's had sort of a resurrection as of late. Simeon Bristol, don't know much about him, but he was active even teaching Monroe Bible study classes in 1824. Lucy Bristol, she went off and moved to Wisconsin. And William Stebbins, you always have to have a mystery. I can't find a thing about him, except that his name is on the list. This is that Jesse Perrin home on Mosley Road. That's going north. How many recognize those greenhouses? That was Hart's Greenhouses that stood at the corner of Mosley and Hulbert. And so Hulbert is right here. The schools would be down here eventually. This photograph is from the 1930s. Pretty early for an aerial photo, right? Not a drone shot. I take the same photo and identify Jesse Perrin's home and then identify where Abner White's home and his wife Huldah Perrin White at the time. You know 249 South Main Street, the big house that is in the process of renovation? Well, that's where Abner White's home stood. It was moved across the street. You probably know that, and it's at 234, that beautiful little yellow local designated property. So imagine how close these people were together. This is the Perrin family, and at one time, there was another Perrin house around here somewhere, long gone. Here is that home of Jesse Perrin, and here is 234 South Main Street in an early photograph from 1939. Lynn Barber lives there now, and her family bought this house on the right, 234, in 1939. Her grandparents bought it. That's how long it's been in that family. But fundamentally, look at the similarities of these houses. And what we believe when we studied this house, and I did the designation, do you still have like a champion of designating? I was a champion on this one. It's a proud feeling. And we believe that this is the original part of the house. This part was added on later, and it was moved across the street from where 249 is. And it, of course, was the replacement for a log cabin that the Whites lived in first. Okay, this early map I like to show because, first of all, when I show this to school kids, and you have the canal, and notice that Fairport isn't even on here. This is 1822. We're just becoming Monroe County. This is the first map, part of Monroe County, the first Monroe County map. And I show kids this, Irondequoit Creek, and there's no Fairport, but this says Fulham for Fulham's Basin. And I ask the kids, what do you think of these are? What are these dark areas? Is this like a topographical feature? Is this a forest? What is this? And they've got some ideas about it. And then I tell them, I think someone spilled grape juice on it, or maybe tobacco juice or something, leaning over the map. It's just a stain. Don't read too much into it. The green dots are for schools because before the Congregational Church had a church in their earliest years for a decade or more, they met either in homes or they met in schools. And the school that they would meet most typically was either school district number 3, which is on Turk Hill Road. As you're going south, you pass the farm. The first place on the left as you're going south, like you're going to Eastview Mall, first place on the left was the District 3 schoolhouse. It's still there today, although the one they met in would have been a predecessor to this one that's still there. It's still very old. And this would be the Midvale School where we know today. But back then, there was a one-room schoolhouse on Baird Road, which doesn't even exist on this map yet. In fact, the only roads you can even see on this map, this one, honestly, I don't even know what it is. It might have been the early version of O'Connor Road. I think Fulham's in the wrong place, or the canal moved, because look at that. And Route 96 going through Bushnell's Basin, Pittsford Victor Road. All right, I told you about a resurrected house, a house that's getting some life pumped back into it, the home of Nathan Norton and Lettice Norton. He's the War of 1812 veteran. He was very involved in town positions, politics, positions, and it's a very early house. And I'm glad to see there's a owner that is looking to make a business there of maple syrup and adventure. Maybe you'll be able to do aerial adventure, zip lining and different things there. There's a lot of land behind the place. So we're looking forward to see how that unfolds. Told you about Cyrus Packard, the first town supervisor. These places don't stand anymore, but Cyrus Packard's tavern, this one, was located about where on Route 31, Pittsford-Pellmeyer Road, about where the entrance to Mason Valley is, in that area, across from Egypt Park. And also his home was a little bit further north, very early places that have been gone for many, many decades. In our town collection, we have protected and saved 65,000 documents, starting in 1813 and going up to the early 1900s, that have been carefully preserved and protected. Your daughter had a hand in this when she was an intern for the town of Perrington a few years back. And they are really in wonderful condition. And I show you this one. This is from the first year, 1813, with the signature of Town Supervisor Cyrus Packard. So it's fun to be able to think about these people and actually show a real connection to them with our archives. I use the 1885 bird's eye view a lot, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that, what a great document it is, and you can zoom in and really see details of properties in the village. And I'm using it here to identify where some of the churches were identified on this document in 1885. And I have added some color so you can see them. But here's the Congregational Church. Here is the Free Baptist Church, the First Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, and way down here, the Catholic Church, and even the predecessor to the Catholic Church. Ironically, the predecessor still exists, the building, but the one that replaced it no longer exists. It's still there, the white one on High Street. It's a little residential building. I zoom in a little bit closer so you can see. Oh, I didn't point out also this one, which was the Universalist Church, right across the street from the Congregational Church. Now, in case you ever want to get a great copy of this thing, you can go to the Library of Congress website, which is an amazing, great resource. Do a search on Fairport 1885, it'll come up, or Bird's Eye View, add that. You can download about an 85 megabyte file, high resolution, save it to your computer. And you can really pull in these properties in detail. The only thing I've never been wild about with this is, it's so authentic and real. And by the way, I've never seen an original copy. Every single one that I've ever seen has this tear in it, even if it's in a frame that's 75 years old. So that's weird. Where there's if you ever find an original, my gosh, that would be worth some money. I like the whole sepia tone thing, but wouldn't it be cool to see it in color? There it is. I got bored and drank some wine for 50 hours this summer, spread over, 3-hour increments, and I colored it. And I digitally colored it with software that I've been using since my children were young. And so it's very archaic and antique. But I'm pixel by pixel by pixel. And I just love it. I'm thinking that at some point, I would love to find a way to have this somewhere. Printed, big, projected, whatever. Because most communities in our area, Rochester has a bird's eye view. In Monroe County, I don't know of another one. I've never seen one. So we're very fortunate to be able to have that. No kidding, 50 hours. I told you about that first Catholic church. This is it. It operated as a grain and feed store 5 days a week and a church 2 days a week on High Street. And when you turn off of North Main Street and go east on High Street, right after you get past the parking lot for the Taylor Building, the next building is this. This is the original First Baptist Church in Fairport. And it was located exactly where the brick church on the corner is. The brick church replaced this. As happened with the Congregational church, the original church simply got too small. And if you've been to any of my talks before, you know I blather on and on about moved structures. And we're up to about 185 in the town and the village. Well, just here are 3 of them. This one a few doors down on West Church Street, the main body of the church, right after they built the new brick one. First they moved it to the back of the lot, and then they decided they sold it for a house. You know where the toy store used to be? That building, what is there, a hairdresser there? So it was moved to that lot, and it burned down 10 years later, and they built the house that is there now. This is across from Greenvale Cemetery. This was the pastor's residence for the church. It still exists, cute little house on East Church Street. This back wing is, of course, on Filkins Street, like so many other moved structures on Filkins and George Street. So there's 3 of our 185 right there. This church, wooden frame early church for the Free Baptists, used to be immediately next door of the Congregational church, the next lot where the Stone Church is today. And they outgrew the building, and isn't it awesome? They outgrew the building, and so it was replaced. In other communities, it would have been dismantled and torn down. Not in this community. It was picked up and moved, and luckily it's had wonderful owners for decades that have taken good care of it. And it's at 154, 156 South Main Street. That is that former church. I think the owner would tell you there's some details inside that you could find if you dig long enough that support, you know, the early construction of this. This is the front. This is facing the street. Right, Fritz? Yep. The Methodist Church in Fairport, you know, there was a Methodist church, by the way, on Cole Street. It was a little tiny place, the size of a garage, and it was a Methodist church. But mostly, the primary Methodist church was right here, built in 1879, across the street almost from the Union School, prominent school building, which was located where the school district's administration building is today. This terrific school used to be here. Well, here is that Methodist church. And important to note about that, we have some structures that were designed by prominent architects. And some of them are laying low beneath the radar. I actually found out this by putting together a puzzle of information. This church was designed by Andrew Jackson Warner, one of Rochester's most well-known architects who designed, for instance, the Powers Building. His son designed the George Eastman House. Andrew Jackson Warner also designed the can factory, the original shoe factory, Peacock Shoe Factory on Parse Avenue. Architects still have to make a buck. And besides their beautiful artistic, you know, they're designing functional buildings as well. But isn't this great? This is George Street. These are outhouses on George Street. This is an early photograph. This is probably about, well, the church was built in 1879. We know it's after that. But this is probably in the early 1880s. Really one of our earlier outdoor photos. This, you know, you look and start to see the details. That's a big house. You know what that is? 2 doors south of the Fairport Historical Museum, the old library, is that big grand house. It's green, it's like of an East Lake design architecturally. That's it, looming there on Perrin Street. Universalist Church, right across from the Congregational Church. Very early church. We don't have a photograph of it, but they took the materials of it when they disassembled it and built St. Luke's Church on the same lot, really where the firehouse is on East Church Street. Built in 1904, and this building has been gone for many decades. There are 4 other churches that are relevant that aren't in the village. And one is in Bushnell's Basin, one was in Egypt, one down in South Perrinton, and one actually in Penfield. But an awful lot of our residents from the northeast corner of Perrinton went to church there. This is the Bushnell's Basin Church. Still stands today. It's not a church. It's undergoing commercial renovation and restoration to some degree. It's still surviving, thankfully, most importantly. And about as old as the congregation, almost 8 years younger than the Congregational Church. This church you may have never seen before. It burned in the 1920s, but this was in Egypt, right about where the plaza is on the north side of the road at 31. And wow, I mean, it looks like we're in the Old West or something. And this was used as a public meeting house after it was a church and during the time when it was a church. For instance, Frederick Douglass spoke here in 1860. He couldn't get into the church because they locked the doors knowing he was coming to try to dissuade him from speaking. And so he spoke to a large crowd outside in weather like this. Same thing happened in Penfield. Within a week, he had a meeting there at a church. It's a big brick church. It was at the Four Corners on the southwest corner where the gas station is. And they didn't lock the doors there. They got in, but they stuffed blankets in the stovepipe. And when they started the fire, it smoked everybody out. Trying to keep people from speaking. South Perrinton Methodist Church. And we can still find remnants to our history that have gone unnoticed. I found this photograph only recently of the South Perrinton Church. And pay attention to this whole area here and how it looks different from a picture I'll show you shortly. This is out on Wilkinson Road. Beautiful church, the only church we have with a cemetery also on the grounds. They started in a schoolhouse just up the street and built this school church shortly after. And this is the Penfield Church. It's right on Route 441, Penfield Road. You can go down Carter Road until you get to Penfield Road, and it's just about at that intersection. So this church was filled with folks from our community. So we don't want to forget them as well. In our 1858 map, it shows where the Congregational Church was. And thanks to Charlotte Clapp, who wrote 100 years ago, the first church building was erected on the site of the present building in 1833. She's trying to say there were 3 churches over the life of the Congregational Church. The one we know now and 2 before it. One built in 1833, one built only 11 years later in 1844. They built such a tiny church and their congregation was growing, and so they replaced it. The builders of those first 2 churches, ironically, were neighbors. The first one was built by Lewis Northrop, the second by Hiram Hayes. This is Baird Road. This is Fairport Road, called Rochester Road in the old days. Here's the schoolhouse where the congregation used to meet. And Northrop lived here, and Hayes lived here. I mean, they lived a couple doors from each other. They were both builders and both built these churches for the congregation. Here's Hiram. I like that man. Look at him. Hiram Hayes, when he passed away in 1882, they wrote in the newspaper, Mr. Hayes was an active man and for many years followed the business of contractor and builder. Many residents in Fairport vicinity were built by him. Also the old wooden structures, the Congregational and Baptist churches. This is how we know he did it. We have to find real evidence. And Chadwick's big block and many others. His contracts were always completed faithfully and without any written word. And then they always go on to say, whoever it was, man or woman, they always go on to say, he was the oldest man in town. Every week there was a new oldest man in town in the newspaper. Oh, and that was his house. on Fairport Road, right about across from where Baird Road intersects, I showed you on the map, with Fairport Road. And look at, what we can't see, and as preservationists, kind of bothers us, I think. Fairport Road, the old Rochester Road, was lined with old houses. Almost all of them are gone. It's understandable. It becomes a thoroughfare to get from one place to another. Progress happens, changes happen. I'm showing you a map or a photograph from about 1939 of the village of Fairport. And this is North Main Street, South Main Street, Liftbridge Lane, back then John Street, then State Street. And the reason I'm showing you this is Hiram Hayes' church was picked up and moved to West Avenue in order to build the brick church that we love today. 185 structures picked up and moved. So there it is, I've circled it. Now I can give you a better look at it right here, and you'll see that there is a facade built to the front of it. And in fact, there's a wonderful square Italianate house here, again, with a commercial facade added to the front as these things changes and businesses were moving in. So it would match with the other, commercial facades on West Avenue. For reference, you know that this is where Canale Park is today in this area. This is a wonderful photograph from the later 1800s showing the former Congregational Church, which by then was known as Shaw's Hall after it moved. We didn't have a village hall. We didn't have a town hall. We didn't have community centers. We had places that functioned as a community center owned by a private individual. And that's what Shaw's Hall was. Musical events, plays, school graduations, events where there were going to be a lot of people. They could sit large crowds. Before the days of a fire marshal's warning saying 99 people, let me tell you about this building quickly. When this building first opened, this floor that we are on here, newspaper articles said, because it was used as a community center as well, that it was capable of holding 800 people. 800 people. They quickly backed off of that, and soon there was fires all across American buildings that were scaring people to death over the vulnerability of these fireproof buildings because they were brick. So that changed in a hurry. Next door, here's that square Italianate building. Both these photos without their facades on the front, so we get to appreciate them. From the days of when it was a church, you see the tall windows, porches were added when it was moved. And here we have members of the Fairport Fire Department out front, and maybe a few sailors. And here it is, Old Shaw's Hall, the former Congregational Church. And it functioned as still a community center and a movie theater. And then on the first floor were shops, typically for years, decades, a hardware store. And in this case, by looking at the signs for what movie was playing, and really zooming in high definition, we can see that these films were playing, Blackmail and Lying Lips, and that the sign actually says out here, White Eagle. So this newspaper is dated April of 1922. So it gives us a feel for pretty precisely of when this photograph was taken. Here's a view from the 1970s, shortly before urban renewal took these buildings down. But you can still see those two buildings with their facades out front. And look what's peeking up here on the old church, the bell tower, or what's left of it. So they were right over here. This is West Avenue as it's being closed off. Here is where Canale Park was added. This is the construction on the garages. These buildings were right here that I just showed you. I do a whole big thing on urban renewal, and not to dwell on that, but also some pretty good things came out of it, like this park that has just wonderful celebrations, really around the calendar, around the year, and these concerts that are populated by hundreds and hundreds of people on Thursday nights. Back to the Congregational Church. Until 1831, the church had made little progress in terms of growing their congregation. Very small progress. But they appointed a couple of deacons. They started to get more members and more activity, and they finally decided they were going to build a church. But look what happened here in 1828. It was resolved that female members of this church, if they wish, will have a vote in all matters of the church. 1828. Susan B. Anthony came to our community, Fairport and Perryton, by my count, at least 5 times that we've been able to document. The first, when she came through with her family on a canal boat heading to Rochester when they moved to Monroe County. Susan B. Anthony was as active as could be in women's rights. But imagine this data point of 1828. And Susan B. Anthony was 8 years old then. And, the 19th Amendment didn't occur until 92 years after that. So pretty neat to think that this church, by the way, who most of their original members were women, had the right to vote so early. So I think that's pretty fun. This is Reverend Jeremiah Butler, and he was as big a reason as any why the brick church stands today that we appreciate on East Church Street. He arrived at the Fairport Church in 1864. He had a resume that was impressive, and these were the pastors, the ministers of the church, and the thing that distinguishes them from him, he was at the church for 14 years. Look at his predecessors, typically 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years. He really led that church to a whole new period of growth and success. And during that period of time, they chose to build the brick church that stands there today, built in 1868 and really opened their doors and celebrated in 1869. This is a painting that's on the church property by Fairport artist Carmen Peck. And she was a well-known artist who lived in Fairport. I got to interview her the year before she died at 100 years of age. She lived out of state for a long time, but she loved Fairport. And these are photographs in the Congregational Church. They used to hold like an annual art show. And here she is with 2 of her children showing paintings that she did in Fairport that were on display there. She was born the day that the shelling began in Europe in World War I, and she was in that city being born when the shelling began. What a way to start. This newspaper article from 1868 in January announces the construction of the First Baptist Church. And it also tells us that the architect would be John Rochester Thomas. Well-known Rochester architect, but known beyond Rochester as really, he was considered to be the father of American churches in that period from the perspective of architecture. He designed easily over 300 churches, mostly in the eastern corridor of the United States. This 1965 photograph of the church, something kind of jumps out at it that is rather startling. It's painted. The church is not painted today. The Baptist church is painted. So we'll get back to that. Here's John Rochester Thomas, father of American church architecture. He designed many other prominent structures and others in Fairport as well, including the Fairport First Baptist Church, Henry DeLand House, the Green Lantern, and that house I pointed out earlier in the photograph on Perrin Street, the big house. He designed that house as well. So we have a nice representation of his work right here in the village of Fairport. Sometimes when these things don't work, right? It's my only trick. Tech guy. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Good point. Here is the Fairport First Baptist Church, designed by John Rochester Thomas, taken from the roof of the Green Lantern, Henry DeLand's house, also designed by John Rochester Thomas. The best place to get a picture of that church because you can see over the trees. Here are other structures, just a sampling, by John Rochester Thomas, terrific brick church in Virginia. And this one is significant for Fairport. It's Brooks Hall. That's the same Brooks family of Brooks Hill School and Brooks Hill. The same extended Brooks family. The money was provided for this hall at the University of Virginia by the Brooks family, and I suspect they recommended the architect. Here's a comparison of the painted church, 1965 photograph, and after the paint was removed, which was in about 1982 or 83, so it wasn't painted that long. But look at the architectural details around the windows here, up here. Look at all the details that were just covered in paint of the same color. And so, thank goodness they took that paint off. I mean, it's a beautiful church, and much of the beauty was obscured by the paint. You know, there was a movement, I would say in the early 50s, where we had painted structures in Fairport, and a sandblaster was going door to door saying, I can take that paint off for you. And in many cases, those brick structures were originally painted when built. They were built of bricks that were intended to be painted. On the other side of the coin, we had unpainted brick structures that started to be painted, like the First Baptist Church, which wasn't painted originally, and this church. So I'm so glad the paint was removed. Horse sheds. Back in the day, churches had horse sheds. People came with horses, with carriages, and this newspaper item about the Congregational Church from 1927 says they're getting rid of the old horse sheds as part of sprucing up the property. And so I show you this 1872 map, which features the Baptist Church in yellow. Here are the horse sheds. The church next to the Congregational Church, horse sheds, Congregational, horse sheds, and even the Universalists, they all had horse sheds. And I can show you what one looked like. Out at South Parrington, these are the horse sheds in about 1900, 1905 or so. And by the way, I told you earlier when I showed you a picture, it had a very conventional steeple. And this modification was made in 1868. They went to this configuration, pulled this feature out here, added these windows. There were no windows up here. All those changes happened in 1868. So that previous photo I showed you was before that. It's one of the earliest photographs that's not of a person that I know of in our community. We have plenty of portraits, but not of architecture. Oh my gosh, 1876, to mark the centennial of the United States, there was celebrations everywhere, including the Congregational Church. And did they have fun with this, especially in the program that they created for this concert? They decided to use ye olde language to illustrate their program. It's a struggle for this great concert to understand. For instance, they identified the name of the time beater as down, left, right, up, Junior. Lots of other fun like that. And this was a 2-night concert, first night, second night. Let's skip to the back of this great concert program where they have some do's and don'ts for those in attendance. I'll try to do this. For as much as many of ye young women who sing have never sung before so many folks and are therefore shamefaced, ye young men present will please be so good as to look away from them when they sing. Don't look at the singers. Unseemly levity and sparking will not be allowed. Does anyone know what sparking is? I even hesitate to ask. As it would tantalize the singers. Ye old ladies will please see that their footstoves are filled so that there may be no noise from putting in of fresh coals. That's what we want, old ladies filling fresh hot coals in their footstoves. Women with young children, if they should cry or grow weary, may as well go and sit by neighbor Bump's fire, as he will kindly leave his latch string out for that purpose. It goes on, but these are pretty fun things that they tried to impress upon the folks that were going to be there. A speaker shortly after that, 1873, no, this was 1878, just a little bit earlier. Vice President Schuyler Colfax, he was vice president for Ulysses S. Grant. Well, he went on a speaking tour around the country after he was vice president. And he spoke about the Civil War, and he spoke about Abraham Lincoln, and he came to our Congregational church. Very known for his opposition to slavery. Our Fairport newspaper announced that he was coming, and they had a little attitude when they announced it. This morning, the Rochester Democrat says, Colfax lectures in Brockport tonight. Not so, Mr. Democrat. Fairport is the place. Our lecture committee wonder if this is a mistake on the part of our contemporary. And what's this with Brockport? It's twice. Long list of, just to show you the archives that exist over on the church grounds of key events that happened at the church from the beginning of time through 200 years of the congregation. You're familiar with, as researchers researching properties, the Sanborn maps that we have. And if you ever see a map and you don't have it, I have digital copies of maps. You can contact me and I will send them to you. This is an example of the corner of Clifford and Fifth Avenue. And I show you this because in 1926, the church purchased a house for a parsonage, and this is it. Very close to you.
My daughter and son-in-law's house.
It is now?
Yes.
Did they know this?
Yeah, they did.
Good.
They did.
Well, what a great neighborhood to live in. And pretty close, right behind you, and pretty close to you. Oh my gosh. Also, there was a parsonage prior to that house. Here's the Congregational church again. The earlier parsonage was right here. Here's the Baptist church. Now you know there's a gas station here today, right? The first house, can you imagine what's there today? It's this house. Well, it's wood frame in this 1960 photograph. Now I'm pointing, there we go. You know the gentleman that lived there, you know what his occupation was? He was a mason. Yeah. Masons are going to mason. Let's talk about the addition for a moment to the church, which happened just about 100 years ago. In 1922, there's a wing off to the east, and it's dedicated to Kathleen Snow by the Snow family, by her parents and her aunt and uncle. The Snows were folks that were very influential, successful business owners in Fairport. Here's Joseph Snow. He was a deacon in the church, and Carrie was a leader in the church choir. And this was their home. I bet you recognize it, on the corner of West Church Street and West Street. Also, a footnote, I found from my records that I do believe the very first automobile in Fairport, and you can find articles that say 10 different cars were the first one. I believe this is the one, was owned by Snow, and it was parked right back here. This photograph is pretty early. That's a gas lamp out front. This is probably from about 1900 or so. Miss Kathleen Snow, she died at a very young age of 13, died in 1907. And so that addition was made. Here's a family picture. And they really gathered a lot of money for the construction of that addition. This is a photograph I just took recently of the beautiful room that is there, about 100 years old now. This little place, I talked about all the parts of the Baptist church that were picked up and moved. This was a building on the grounds of the previous wood church, and it was moved. This note says 1872. I have no documentation to confirm that date, but it is on Filkins Street. And that is right about when Filkins Street opened. George Filkins laid out George Street and Filkins Street, and he immediately started populating them with many structures that were picked up off of Main Street and Church Street, and some others, and put them on those two streets. Then he filled in many of the existing lots that weren't filled with houses that he built, because not only was he a house mover, he was a house builder. You know, what was Fairport Savings Bank, what's it called now? Pardon me? Evans. He built that building. That was Filkins Meat Market. Here's an interior shot of the Congregational Church 100 years ago. They took pictures for their 100th anniversary. So fortunately, we have photographs now. Here's an exterior picture 100 years ago, and there's a strange, almost cosmic thing going on here. There's like this white sphere that at first I was concerned about, and then I realized it's a hole punch. People, don't punch holes in your 100-year-old pictures. It appears again in this one, this interior photograph of the church. Glad to have these early images. Again, we don't have that many interior photographs of our early structures. Here's a picture from 1941, which is all about this event, the annual Children's Day program. And here they are right out in front of those front doors. And lo and behold, second row, this kid right here, one Douglas Whitney. He's like, where's Waldo? He turns up in all my pictures. First Congregational Church of Fairport, dedicated in 1869, is on the National Register of Historic Places. Of course, it's a prized Fairport designated landmark. And you know, this community has done a good job of identifying some opportunities for National Register designation as well. Gene Whitney played a large role in both of those designations of this church. It talks about the 1868 American Round Arch Romanesque Revival building was expanded 3 times. 2 brick wings were added, 1900 and 1924. I just talked about one of those. And the 2-story Southwest office addition built in 1951. A lot of research goes into these applications, and we were rewarded with the designation. In that 1924 celebration, the speaker, the Reverend Harry Barstow, made some comments that I think were pretty interesting. 100 years from now, will this church be in existence at that time? Will there be a First Congregational group in the village of Fairport? Will there be such a place as Fairport? Will Americans still exist? Who can tell? America has grown with miraculous rapidity in the 150 years of her history. Will she fade as quickly or still go on from strength to strength? No one can tell. But if America persists and Fairport is here, and this church is in one form or another remains, it will be because they are faithful to certain fundamental principles that have made their past history and alone can guarantee their future. Wouldn't those folks celebrating 100 years ago be happy to learn that we're even having this conversation? From my friend Scott Diamond from the town of Perrington, who's pretty good at operating a drone, among other things. He provided a drone photograph from us. And one viewing from the steeple and from the cross on top of the steeple over the Green Lantern, over to the west to the Baptist Church, and you can even see the Rochester skyline in the distance. And that's really what I came to talk to you about tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. And there's so much of great history to talk about in our community. It's a pleasure to be able to do it with you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing in preservation.